Thank you. Good presentations all. This question can be addressed to any of you. I think Maurie tied together most of the comments you've all made. How much of this would have happened had we not seen since the 1970s the massive change in tax policy which has allowed this enormous drain of wealth from the poor to the rich? In other words, many of the trends that you talked about, Maurie, have to do with the gross inequity, and in fact, the purchasing power of the lower half of society has fallen off the table. Would that have happened without the massive shift toward right-wing policies and the tax misdistribution in the country?
Well, nobody has really well-grounded answer in research, but when you think about millennials who are more interested in urban living than suburban living, I think there may be the element of affordability in it, but I think it's a real cultural shift in lifestyle preferences. But nobody has actually done this research, because it could very well be that these young people, college graduates who do not see a lot of prospects for themselves with jobs, good jobs, they say, might as well live in a city because it's easier to somehow patch my life together than if I aim for the suburbs, where the options are rather limited in housing and everything else. So I think this is a very good question for research. We do surveys which tell us what people think, but they don't tell us why they think that way. So I think it's a combination of economic reality, but also a real cultural shift in how do I want to live that I will enjoy my life. I think it's a combination.
Thank you. Can we take another question? We've got one back here, and if you would introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hello, Jason Pearson from the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council. Cindy, you mentioned some research that you had done, I think recently, I think you said in Stockholm, that suggested that I couldn't tell if it was carbon intensity perhaps, of urban dwellers was higher than that of rural dwellers by a factor of 4. Was I hearing you right?
Yes, but only, is this on? Yeah, but only if you include consumption-based emissions.
Right. So I'm curious, and then Halina, you had talked about suburban dwellers being actually lower intensity than rural, and I'm curious whether that has to do with a methodological difference in the calculations, or whether that's a difference between urban versus suburban versus rural, and that suburban is going to be higher. Just curious about where the research is on that.
No, it's completely the way that it's calculated. So production-based, I don't feel like this is working. Is it working? That traditional emissions-based accounting.
Yeah, I get the difference between production and consumption-based.
Okay.
My question is, I see it, I guess it's for Halina, are you using a production or consumption-based measure? And if you're using a consumption-based measure, then is your data, are your two data sets in conflict, or what's going on there?
Well, to be honest with you, I'm citing studies that were done by others. But if you go, for example, to the website of the Census Bureau, it tells you that something like 85% of Americans live in urban areas, right? But they don't tell you how they define it. And the statistic that I cited from another source says that only 4% of Americans live in urban areas that are at least 30 households per acre. So you can see it's an issue of methodology, very much methodology. So I can't sort it out very well without further.
I guess the question is kind of common knowledge. Seems to be common knowledge in our community that it's lower intensity to live in cities. Cities are better than rural, and yet it seems like what you're suggesting is that's different. I'm curious what's going on there.
Maybe Bill Rees, clarify.
Okay, if you can clarify, and then we'll move on.
in general, people move to cities because of higher incomes. And in general, certainly globally, urban consumers have much bigger footprints than rural consumers do.
Thank you. Question here and then there.
So I'm Tom Bowerman with Policy Interactive, and what I hear from these three presentations is maybe approximately 6 fairly complex overarching themes, and I'm just going to try to grab 1 or 2 of them and kind of pose it as a question, which is this idea of the middle class, and kind of following Bill Rees's comment about this characterization of the middle class kind of falling off the edge or being squeezed so badly. And if we look at the long trajectory of economic growth, the actual decline of the middle class in this present case is really relatively modest compared to historical trends. And we're now sitting at barely 5% below the peak, whereas if we compare ourselves to the 20s, where the representation of people that lived through that era report quite satisfactory lives, we're like 20 times above that level, or 10 to 20 times, depending on which metrics we're using. So is it conceivable that if we're looking at the concept of consumption in this culture, that there's a lot more elasticity than you're giving credit for when you're talking about this so-called social justice issue, and when you need to recalibrate in relative to what may be sustainable, and having this expectation that this falling off and this squeezing and the characterizations of these pictures that are given, that there's this great catastrophe that's at hand, and we need to really rethink of what level do we need to be at to sustain, and what is sustenance in terms of its quality of life, and kind of break away from this expectation of this metric of where we've arrived and that we've fallen down a little bit, saying, oh my God, we're going off the cliff. So if you get what I'm talking about in terms of this characterization and maybe any kind of response towards that. Thank you.
Well, I think what we've seen is that the trends that I'm speaking to, are certainly not post-2008. That they're much deeper, and they go back, in many cases, to the 1970s. What we've seen is a series of strategies effectuated by particularly middle-class consumers to kind of keep their heads above the water under challenging circumstances. So, the first strategy that the middle class put into play was that the increase of female labor force participation, so sending women out to work, certainly a beneficial response in many respects, but as has sometimes been described, is that sort of took away a degree of freedom from households, because previously female labor force participation, at least outside of the poorest households, was provided a cushion. So during periods of exigency, women working provided a form of supplementary income. So but women can only go out to work. You can only mobilize that strategy once. After that played itself out, we had tax reform and other regulatory reform that Bill made mention of, and it was the use of consumer credit that provided the buffering cushion for middle-class households. I would contend, that much of the political attention that's been devoted, especially in the United States over the last number of years, to cutting taxes is the third strategy. So reducing the amount of money that households are paying out in taxes and making that available for private consumption. Now, I don't know what the next strategy is going to be that will, in the absence of significant increase in wages, will enable households to continue to maintain the what is generally regarded as an expected level of middle-class consumption. But we may be reaching the end of implementable strategies that is now going to begin to force much more significant adjustment than we've thus far seen.
We have time for one more question, unfortunately. So we'll go right here, and if you don't get a chance to ask your question out, we will have a plenary session where we can raise these issues again. So make a note to yourself, please.
I'm just putting all the concepts together of consumption, but where does charitable giving lie in the concept of consumption? As we as the U.S. are more and more one of the most generous countries in the world, and I think is there a point where there's a balance between consumerism and charitable giving at the same time?
I think that there are a lot of different answers to that question. I'm not exactly sure where to go, but I will say that I did my master's research on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and I always thought it was very interesting that when people would come from off the res, they would come on and they would be very distraught by the waste that was kind of strewn around, and it completely didn't jive with their notions of kind of ecologically noble Indian, right? And these stewards of the earth, thinking seven generations out. And the reality was that they didn't have funding for trash collection. But the other reality is that a lot of our charitable donations, gosh, I really am straight from Saturday Night Live. A lot of our donations end up being what we call donation dumped. So I remember having a conversation with a woman who was in her 40s and had several children, and she said, if I get another pair of size 6 jeans, I'm just gonna flip out, because they would get these massive truckloads of appliances, clothing, everything that you and I take to secondhand stores, right? And they're literally dumped on the reservation. And without any sort of trash capacity, it becomes a burden, right? I mean, I know that sounds crazy. The other thing to think about is there's this great documentary called T-Shirt Travels that looks at I don't know if I see some heads nodding, it's a great one, I use it in class all the time. Our fashion has driven, replacement of wardrobes very frequently, right? And we see in, for example, Zambia in this case, just the mass infusion of secondhand T-shirts into the Zambian market, which literally destroyed their domestic textile trade. So, again, there is a downside, even when we think about the stuff that we, clean out our closets and give to charity. There's a downside there too sometimes. So,
we're gonna close off this portion and take a break.